And my hope is that you're also pushing yourself to get out of the space of, I must, provide value to these masters, and instead start getting yourself into that position of saying, I'm going to be the welcoming hand that is outstretched to the client to say, come with me. I will show you how we can create value for your audience or your product.
Motion design right now feels a little bit like being shot out of a cannon. Everything's moving so fast. There are brand new tools and technologies being launched practically every week, and clients are grappling with the changes almost as much as us artists. So to help make sense of all of this, John LePore is back on the podcast. John was the executive creative director at Perception last time he came on, and since then, he's partnered up with Jared Yater, who previously served as managing director at both PsyOp and The Mill. Together, they have formed BlackBox Infinite, a creative consultancy that aims to help brands explore the cutting edge of design, technology, AI, and of course, motion. In this conversation, we talk about the mega viral F1 augmented reality concept that helped launch BlackBox Infinite, and all of the tools, disciplines, and skills that artists can develop to gain a foothold in this brave new world. If you're wondering what the next 5 to 10 years of your career could look like, listen up. John, it is awesome to have you back on the podcast. It was a few years ago that you came on. You were still at Perception, and I want to talk about all the amazing stuff that you've been up to. But the first thing I wanted to ask you was, in the pre-interview, you had this amazing quote, and I wanted to ask you about it. The quote was, "What we do can be magic. Make sure you find a stakeholder, even if only occasionally, who sees you as a magician." And I thought that was beautiful. Did you steal that quote? Is that from you? What does that mean?
That just comes out of my sort of challenges or frustrations, spending many years working in an environment or a landscape where everyone in the industry that I was in motion design, one of the best things you could do would be catering to your masters at the ad agencies or whatnot. And it's not just ad agencies. There's other clients who I would consider to be clients that are constantly working with motion designers and studios and agencies that have these talents. And I just kept noticing these downward sort of trends in terms of the quality of the relationship with those kinds of clients who would just look for every possible opportunity to pit studios against each other, or they felt like there wasn't much of a sense of loyalty or whatnot in that sort of space with those clients. Even when you're delivering killer projects for them that they're thrilled with, it's still, next time one comes up, you're back to bidding or pitching against 4 or 5 other entities. And I realized that once I started drifting further and further from that space and that environment, and working for clients and brands and entities that weren't sort of like we just churn through motion design service providers left and right.
Right.
They were the folks that were getting me more inspired about what I was doing, because they seemed to genuinely appreciate the craft and the skill, and they just saw what we were doing as something magic. It was easy to get them excited and passionate about the concepts and the ideas and the materials that you were building. And to me, that just changed the dynamic of just what it felt like to do my job, to do work, right? And so to me, it's really critical that you find anywhere along, even if it's just on occasion, you find some clients that you are working for who are especially appreciative. Because I don't know, I mean, there's a lot of other people who have all sorts of other jobs and roles that they could explain them to me, and I could sit with them and be like, oh, there is an art to, insurance sales or something like that. But the work that we do does very easily lend itself towards people dropping their jaw and just being like, that's what you do? Like, you get paid to do that? That's so amazing. That's so exciting. That's so impressive. That's so beautiful or interesting or fascinating. And so I think it's really important for people to have those touch points or those experiences because I worry that too many people in these industries get stuck in this sort of like creative Stockholm syndrome where you're just desperate to please your masters wherever they may be. And that, I don't know, I feel like that ends up introducing a lot of other toxic anxiety into your process and the work that you're doing that ends up limiting, I think, a lot of broader and more ambitious potential.
Do you think that, I've sort of noticed this trend over the last, it's probably the last 10 years, but it feels like it's accelerating. And it's this trend of motion being something that's used primarily for advertising and marketing. And now it's being embedded in products at deeper and deeper levels, and bigger companies, Tesla, the interface of their car. It's a giant motion design project in one sense. Do you find that dynamic is different when your client is asking you to make something for advertising versus making something for product, which I guess in my mind, that's a longer term relationship thing versus we need a 30-second commercial 4 times a year. We'll see you in 3 months. Does that make a difference with the relationship with your client?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the exact sort of like contrasting experiences that I've been fortunate to have in my career where, working on broadcast graphics or advertising or whatnot, you're typically working for people who are churning through projects, churning through studios or vendors or however they want to sort of commoditize it. And when you are collaborating with people who are making a product, who are making a thing, you're all working really closely together with a singular goal in mind to create the best product that you can. So there's a much deeper collaborative spirit that goes on there. But you're also working with people who aren't like, oh yeah, we churn out, even if you were working with Tesla, there's not going to be someone there that's like, oh, we just churn out 3D, autopilot visualizations every 3 months, and then we tweak it again and do it again, and we're re-delivering the same thing. Like, it's always new, fresh challenges. It's always new problems to solve. And I just find that changes that dynamic. And it's, and you're not just making this linear piece of marketing material. You're making something that people are going to use, they're going to interact with. And so you're constantly, challenging yourselves to keep improving it. It's also a space where sometimes projects never end. You just, ship a version and then you go back to adjusting it and continuing to improve it for the next version. But for me, I love applying this discipline to those sort of environments, those sort of projects, and working with those kinds of clients. And a big part of it is just because the dynamic of collaboration and the relationship is so much more respectful, so much more positive, and for me, much more fulfilling. And I do know a lot of people who, like, their dream is to make a commercial for a pair of headphones or a phone or something like that. But I'm always trying to tempt people and whisper in their ear, but you could make the phone, you could make the headphones, you could be making the actual product instead of just the commercial for that. Like, we need that. We need that skill set applied into the actual tangible experience itself.
I love that. There's a motion designer I follow on X named Ben Frick. He's an amazing 3D artist, and he's
Ben's
designing
incredible.
this keyboard, and I'm following this, and I'm like, I feel like motion designers, really any kind of designer, and especially 3D artists, already have 90 to 95% of the tools you need to ideate and come up with concepts that can actually turn into not just physical products, but the kind of things that you're talking about. And some of the stuff that we're going to get into, experiences that you can have on a Vision Pro, stuff like that. So the last time you were on, I believe you were still the ECD at Perception.
Yep.
And, we talked a lot about the work you were doing there on, film, fake UI and stuff like that. And now it may be public by the time this launches, but you've been working, you said before we started recording, in stealth, building a different kind of sort of practice or consultancy. So I'm wondering if you could sort of take us back to the decision to leave Perception and, move into this sort of brave new world which is still developing and changing daily, it seems like.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was at Perception for a very long time. I was there for 16 years at the time that I departed Perception. And I had an incredible 16 years there. I loved everything about the studio, the people that I was collaborating with, the clients that I was working with, the opportunities that were presented to me through that time. And also the fact that, Perception carved out this sort of niche or capability that was also really closely tied to the things that I was personally passionate about and very excited about. And so after 16 years or so, there was a sort of momentum that I had built up just in terms of the projects that we were approaching. I was really excited about some of the more strategic attributes of how the work and the projects were coming together, and really engaged with and fascinated with the way that we had opportunities with clients who just needed guidance. They didn't just need deliverables, but they needed a lot of insight. They needed almost a bit of like coaching or someone to guide them through the sort of fog of innovation. And so that became something I was just increasingly passionate about. And I felt that the best way to keep pushing that further and to keep expanding that as a service was to go out on my own and create my own entity. And so my business partner and I founded BlackBox Infinite just about a year ago. We've been working pretty much in stealth mode for the last year as we've been just sort of honing in on how we provide a service and how we can deliver this to the clients that we're working with and give them the right sort of value that they deserve. And yeah, I'm really excited to finally be publicly launching this and sort of pushing this further out there into the world, because there's a lot of different attributes about what we're doing that I'm extremely excited about.
Well, that's awesome. Well, congratulations. I know even someone with your history and your pedigree, it's always hard to start a business. So I applaud anyone who attempts it, and especially something that's kind of on the cutting edge like this. So I wanted to ask you about this amazing thing that I saw. I think it was probably about a year ago now, that I don't know if you produced, if you creative directed it, but it was right when the Vision Pro came out. And there was this demo of a Formula One sort of app, I guess, where you could wear the headset and you could watch a live 3D representation of a real race. And you had kind of, it's kind of the thing that I guess you've become known for. It's sort of like you know about all these cool technologies and tools, and you can imagine how you can kind of shove them together like Legos to create something where, it's more than the sum of its parts. So I'd love to hear a little bit about the story behind that particular thing, which went mega viral. I saw it everywhere. And it was also right around the time I think Brett Morris did something similar, imagining what if your Tesla buying experience was done in VR? What would that look like? Was that part of your launch strategy for BlackBox Infinite? Was it just something you wanted to do? I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that was a number of things. It certainly is a passion project of sorts, but it also was a critical piece of launching BlackBox and getting our name out there, particularly because, and one of the reasons that we named the practice BlackBox is because almost all of the work that we do is extraordinarily confidential. And the things that we have been working on for the past year, we may not be able to share those things for a few more years, maybe never. We may not be allowed to share some of these things at all. And that's just sort of the nature of the work that we find ourselves doing in this relatively competitive space of behind the scenes innovation in technology. And so it was important that we could flex our thinking, our mindset, our ability to execute, and really just put some ideas out there into the ether. And I'm not I'm far from the most savvy social media guy, and I'm always feel that there's so much more that we should be posting and sharing and figuring out the, promotion schedule cycle or whatnot. But I found that just by putting some of these thoughts or ideas and being able to have them go just a step beyond being a, whiteboard doodle or a theoretical conversation, I found that approach was generating a bit of impact and getting some traction. So there were some other things that we had put together and shared, sometimes just based on something that was topical or happening in the design and technology space. This Formula One prototype is something that actually was a concept that I had formally pitched to Formula One back in 2018 as part of a contest. And I was a finalist in the 2018 Formula One Innovation Prize and was flown out to the Austin Grand Prix and received a trophy that was handed to me by 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton. Was I named my cat after Lewis Hamilton. It was the most exciting day of my life. And I was honestly a little disappointed that the idea and the concept just didn't really get traction within Formula One from that point going forward. I was eagerly expecting, all right, cool, let's implement this, let's put this together. And it was an ambitious idea, and that may have had something to do with, why it never went anywhere in 2018. But I figure with the Apple Vision Pro coming out, which I believe is a magical piece of hardware. I'm fully on board with a lot of the critiques or complaints that there are around it, but I do think it's a platform that, as it continues to grow and evolve, is something that is literally making magic possible. It is, you can put this thing on and in theory, you can hallucinate almost anything, right? And if you try on the headset or you do the demos or you play around with one of these things, you quickly find that all of the experiences are effectively like a phone app or an iPad app that's floating on a rounded rectangle in space or on 10 rectangles floating in space, which that's pretty cool. And to be able to arrange that sort of stuff. But it's also you kind of if you had enough monitors at home, and you could buy a lot of monitors with $3,500. You could do the same thing with all of your apps and tools and experiences and whatnot. And I was shocked that for this amazing piece of hardware, I wasn't seeing things that felt like they were taking advantage of these capabilities that are there, of the three-dimensional space that they call it. It's a spatial experience, and still it's just a spatial experience with flat stuff everywhere. And so I thought this would be the perfect place to revisit this Formula One concept and build it out and flesh it out a bit more. I worked with a few folks, including my buddy Sanu Sagar, who did some great renderings and whatnot. We mocked this up and we put this together. We basically just presented this as these are the rules that we have to work within because there are technological limitations. But also, Formula One is the perfect sport to take advantage of something like this. There are people that have been theorizing that, yes, you could see a volumetric NBA game, or I don't know if you saw the Toy Story NFL broadcast that they did last season. Those things are really impressive and really interesting, but they have severe limitations around them. The brilliance of making an NFL game in real time rendered as toys is perfect because you can get positional data of the players as they run down the field. But when you're watching a football game, you want to see the sweat, you want to see which way the shoelaces are swinging and the hair that's hanging out underneath the helmet. And we can't yet get real-time tracking data that will capture all of that. In a Formula One race, positional data if you just have that, it's very easy to make a sort of, hard body model of a car that's accurate to that position. So I figure Formula One, well, it's going to get you like 99% of the way there to that fidelity that you're used to seeing. So we put this together, we mocked it up, we put it out there into the world. And I was very optimistic that it would get some traction and, get some views within my community and maybe in some adjacent spaces. And I was absolutely astounded that it went as far as it did. It went very mainstream. ESPN was reposting it. Marquez Brownlee, who to me is a critical tastemaker. He featured it on his YouTube channel twice in the same week.
Wow.
And it was thrilling to me to see it resonate, to stir up a lot of conversation in the technology space, in the Formula One community, in the sports technology community at large, and in a whole bunch of other spaces. And so it's been a lot of fun to see that move around, and I still take tremendous delight in that when I'm talking to, a potential new client or whatnot, they'll, sometimes say to me like, well, I had to talk to you because people kept sending me that video, multiple people. I was getting annoyed with how many times people were sending me that video and saying, hey, could we do this for our product or our experience? And for me also, it's just worth noting the concept of doing sort of speculative work like this. To me, it's a sort of bizarre thing. It's a little bit of a strange thing, or I feel almost hesitant in a certain sense around just that notion of the 1,000th kid on Dribble to redesign the Netflix homepage or something along those lines. But for me, it was really important that we sort of set ourselves apart by really showcasing the strategy and the thought and the technology underpinning all of this, and the way that this wasn't just sort of let's throw a new coat of paint on something, but let's really look behind the scenes at what the opportunities are, how we can take advantage of them, and also how we can be extremely respectful and knowledgeable about the constraints and limitations when you're putting something like this together.
I mean, this to me seems like it's developing into a very popular way to launch a new thing, in modern times. I mean, there's a visual effects app called Simulon. They may have a website now, but they didn't for the longest time. It's just the founder and maybe a couple of employees posting stuff that goes viral over and over again. And that's it. And this is how bands launch now. So I actually think that doing spec work, I think for a while it felt a little tainted because it feels like, oh, you're working for free, you shouldn't do that. But it's marketing, and especially doing what you're doing, I don't know of any other way to market yourself because, preparing for this interview, I go to your website and you've got all these amazing projects, and half of them you click on and there's a password or you can't show it, right? Because a lot of this stuff is NDA. I want to ask you about the Vision Pro. I've never actually worn one. Everyone I know who has says it's incredible, but they said basically what you said, there's some pretty big problems that need to be solved. And I'm curious what you think those problems are. Is it the technology? Is it too heavy? Or is it the stuff that you were talking about where we're still using conventions from using an iPad, but now it's just a virtual one in 3D space? Is it more of just the conceptual side of it? What needs to change before it's a mass adopted thing?
I think it's going to take a bit of time before it is this ubiquitous technology product or experience in the way that our phones are. And I think we will get to that point eventually, and there will be certain experiences that you can't even prepare or present until it is at that point. But to me, the roadmap is there's, obviously technological or hardware based limitations. It's a big chunky thing that you wear and it's heavy and whatnot. And that'll evolve over time. There's a sort of social acceptance factor of, will there be a point at which it's actually acceptable to wear this in public, which sounds absurd, but I also remember people thought that you would look ridiculous with AirPods, in your ears, right? And we know how commonplace that is. That's a really important piece to me because I do think the idea of, and when I think of Apple Vision Pro, I'm thinking of it almost exclusively for what we would describe as augmented reality, as opposed to virtual reality, as opposed to like, I'm going to get lost in a fictional room or space or planet or whatnot. I'm thinking of, I can see the world around me and it's augmented. There's something that's being changed or modified about the world around me. And to me, the most compelling use cases for that experience exist outside of your home. They exist in environments and places that you don't know inside and out. And at home, like, there's some cool stuff. Like, it's cool to know, like, the temperature of the surface of your frying pan or, you know, things of that nature, and have little bits of extra data or tags, or see the heat map on your floor of your Wi-Fi signal strength or something like that, right? But the most compelling things are going to be places that are unfamiliar to you, that you all of a sudden can have this like heightened level of mastery, of understanding of while you're there, whether that's navigating through the supermarket or attending a sporting event or things of that nature. There's like endless sort of opportunities that are there. The other piece of it is definitely just the conceptual side of digital product design and experience. Currently is a very mature discipline. And I always point out that like app design or modern digital experiences, like, I think that's probably been the area of design, like of all sectors of design, including architecture and, you know, fashion and whatnot. I feel like the most money has changed hands, the most evolution and, you know, change to the industry has all been around digital product design and digital experience design over the last 10 to 15 years. And that discipline is pretty mature at this point. If you need to make an app and you know what your goals or your mission is or the outcomes that you're looking for, there's really well-defined best practices and approaches to do that effectively and successfully. I think almost all of that mindset is hitting a very hard ceiling when we all of a sudden start jumping to these newer paradigms. And that could be, you know, spatial and augmented reality, or it could even be artificial intelligence or any of these other new things that are happening in technology. And there's pieces of that discipline and those best practices, there's pieces or ingredients, or at least the spirit of them, that carry over. But a lot of it requires a very hyper imaginative rethinking of how these things come together. And so, like, I was sort of almost shocked in my disappointment when the first wave of Apple Vision Pro experiences were all like rounded rectangles floating in your space. But it's also very easy to imagine. Well, yeah, the teams and the companies and the brands and this legacy of how they've been building these things has been pretty well set in stone. And they're probably thrilled that they're able to like get to the point of being like, look, the app icon is lifted 2 millimeters forward from, you know, the back plate or whatnot, right? In that space and in that environment, I look around at my friends and colleagues with this motion design background, and I just know every single one of them could take a much more ambitious, much more radical way of thinking about these experiences that I think will begin to eventually push these platforms to the next level.
That's awesome. Yeah, you're getting me really excited to go try one of these things. What are the skills that a motion designer needs to sort of foster to be able to do this kind of work? You know, this really sort of conceptual, what could we do with this technology? Let me go out there and sort of create some demos for potential clients, because the clients themselves may not even know what they're looking for yet. You know, like our audience, primarily traditional motion designers. So good designers, good animators, good 3D artists. Some of them are good illustrators. Is there something else though that you need to cultivate, like UX, or I don't know, like coding? Like, does it get more technical in this world? What are the things that you look for or that you've had to sort of train yourself on?
So there's a lot of different attributes that I think are like motion design adjacent that are important. And there's things like just the fundamentals of user experience or human-centered design, right? Information design and those sort of concepts. But in a much broader sense, I think you have to be extraordinarily empathetic towards a number of different factors. You need to be empathetic towards your end user and what they will need from this experience. You need to be empathetic to the engineering side of things, or even just the broader technological climate, and really understand that we as motion designers, we can dream up anything that we want, right? Like we could just be like, and then all of a sudden you're walking down the street and an ocean sweeps down the street and there's, fluid simulations crashing off of the sides of buildings and whatnot. But you need to have a certain appreciation and understanding for what are some of the limitations that are out there. You need to be empathetic and sensitive to the needs of the businesses that are making these kinds of products and what their goals or objectives are as they're putting these things out there into the world. And just do your best to, there are a lot of sort of theoretical concepts that are out there in the world. And to me, the biggest difference are the ones, and, anyone who's even slightly savvy in the technology space can like look at something and be like, that's a vaporware concept from and to me, I just think of like, that's a kid in a basement having fun with the tools, making something very imaginative and exciting and interesting, but I can't even come close to taking it seriously because it's blind to some of these factors of creating products in the real world. I mean, making digital products is very difficult. There's many different kinds of challenges that you can come across. And so I think just being as self-aware and in touch with some of those limitations and constraints, but then seeing like, okay, well, and that legacy of app designers, they all feel constrained by that sort of stuff. But then just looking for and hunting for, well, what is the gap between those constraints? Where is there some freedom, and where does that freedom align with that magic that I do that they can't do, that they definitely can't handle and whatnot. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in these spaces, and I expect to see more of this opening up, and I expect big technology brands to almost be tapping into maybe like some of their internal marketing teams that may be flush with 3D gurus and people that are much more savvy in things than people who are like Figma wizards on the other side of the sort of fence are, and just will be continuing to look for ways to blend those kinds of competencies together.
Yeah. So I feel like, and this is what's really exciting to me at the moment is the intersection of motion design and UX, UI sort of product design, because I think there's just so much surface area there for people who are good designers and good animators to add so much extra value to, to experiences basically. But in doing that, I also know that there's a little bit of a different sensibility that you have to bring to it. And there's this acronym that I just discovered while I was doing research on you called HMI. I think it's a human machine interface. And I think I heard you talking about it in relationship to the UI for, it might have been Porsche's dashboard. It was for some car, sort of the digital dashboard in front of the steering wheel. And this idea that, if you're a good motion designer, you could design something really cool and amazing. And if it was for a movie, that's what you do. But the first thing you need to be concerned with is actually safety, right? Which is not something that motion designers are used to. Like when I open After Effects to animate something, I'm not thinking, am I going to hurt someone with this decision? So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. That might be a good sort of use case to get into. Like, how do you learn about that stuff? And how does that affect the coolness of what you're actually able to do on the design side?
Yeah, so this is an area where that sort of empathy that I was describing is really critical. So when you're in the automotive industry, they describe it as HMI, the human machine interface. That's just sort of their internal term for the instrumentation or other interfaces that you're interacting with within the vehicle. And in a vehicle, if that any part of that experience is distracting or confusing or hard to read, the worst case scenario for your user is like really, really bad, right? Like it's absolutely awful. And so you do have to put a tremendous emphasis on safety and being, thoughtful and considered about that. And I get really so I'm a big car geek. That's one of the reasons that I got into doing this sort of work with many of the automotive brands out there. And it always broke my heart to go behind the doors of these car companies where to me, that's like going into like the Charlie's Chocolate Factory. And I'm just like, this is where magic is made. There's, there's physical design, there's software, there's engines, and all of these different things all coming together to make these unbelievably complex products. And I was deeply disappointed to find that in those environments, it was, and this is consistent in many other industries as well, it was just this sort of legacy of like, the design team versus the engineering team, and the design team just solely being like, we want our cool designs to be cool. And the engineers being like, we need them to be safe and efficient and, affordable to produce and whatnot, and just butting heads with each other. And to me, that's like no way to make any kind of product. I think you need to be in an environment or in a space where those teams are very empathetic towards each other's goals and desires. And you want the engineers to be invested in helping the designers make something that's as beautiful as they want it to be. But the designers should be just as concerned as the engineers are with the product not hurting the people that are using it, right?
Right.
So there's a lot of different, and, automotive HMI can be particularly difficult. Lots of constraints, lots of limitations, lots of regulatory factors that you're working within. But I've found that, if your creative team can be in tune with those concerns and anticipating those concerns and really, treating them as their own responsibility as well, you can make some incredible progress. And I've been very disappointed to see projects or teams structured where it's actually just like, no, the designers make their art. And then months later, someone comes in with a red pen and tells them where they're not meeting the requirements for legibility or contrast or the size of typefaces or things like that. I think it should be everybody's problem to share. And I just think designers are, the people that I've encountered in my career are brilliant, thoughtful designers everywhere. And I think they're all very capable of taking that responsibility on themselves rather than just sort of like recklessly making their own thing and waiting for someone else to come along and sort of correct it or adjust it.
Do you think that the automotive industry is like a really good area for motion designers to be focused right now? Because I feel like a lot of the work that you do, it's under NDA, so you can't really show it off. But every new car, like the interfaces are getting more and more sort of screen-based, and I have mixed feelings about that too. But I mean, it is what it is, and there's a lot of like really cool interfaces, and then there's this other thing. Actually, you could probably, and I just learned about this morning actually, and it kind of blew my mind. Maybe you could talk about this idea of a software-defined vehicle, which from what I understand, it's basically kind of what a Tesla is, where you can change the acceleration profile via software, like over like a over-the-air update. And so it just seems like there's going to be a much greater need for communicating to the user of these vehicles through design. Motion is part of that, especially if it's a vehicle that moves. So maybe you could talk a little bit about like software-defined vehicles and just sort of the landscape of work out there for motion designers who can sort of take a few steps in that direction and learn some of these principles. Is that a good place? Would you recommend people kind of, maybe take a trip out to Detroit, go look around?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, obviously I'm passionate about this space. I think there's some really fun and interesting opportunities in here. And it is an exciting time in this environment. Technology in cars has traditionally been fucking miserable, has been the worst part of the automotive experience across almost every single brand, across every different, whether it's a cheap car or a really, really expensive car, the technology all seems miserable compared to the technology that we experience in the rest of our lives. The automotive brands have been, over the last decade, slowly waking up to realize that this is an important thing for their customers. And so they're all starting to put more and more emphasis on this. Each of the brands are restructuring internally to find ways to put larger and more critical teams in front of digital experience in these vehicles. And as opposed to, say, designing, an app for a smartphone, which typically is designed from a point of view of making something that's the most universal product in the world, vehicles still have a personality to them, right? They still have a sort of character to them that allows you to design something that maybe is a little less sterile or generic than it may be in other digital experience spaces. And so I think there's a lot of really fun things that are happening in that space in general. And this notion of the software defined vehicle is just, it's reinforcing more and more that, especially as vehicles, as electric vehicles become more common, the difference between one electric vehicle and another is not as big of a difference as it was between a 4-cylinder Kia and a V8 Mercedes-Benz or whatnot. They sort of have very similar characteristics now. Even an inexpensive EV has really great acceleration and is really snappy to drive around and whatnot. And so the manufacturers of these vehicles are looking at the digital experience as a key, differentiator between brands and between their product and their competition. And that's where this whole concept of the sort of software defined vehicle has really come into play. And so for me, it's also a fascinating space because it's an area where starting to realize that these digital experiences, and, I spent many, many years doing things like creating instrument clusters and the infotainment operating systems that you have your navigation and your music and all of that stuff a part of. I love doing all of that kind of work, but I've gotten particularly engaged over the last several years in looking at ways that the digital experience goes beyond just the pixels that are on the screen. And that could be things like even the sounds that cars make. Electric vehicles, which are traditionally silent, they actually have a legislated requirement to have a noise that they will emanate at parking lot speeds as a sort of safety mechanism. But that is an opportunity to say, well, what is the personality of that sound? You can now, the sound isn't created by the arrangement of cylinders and the combustion of fuel inside the engine. It's something that you can choose for that sound to be whatever you want it to be. And looking at ways that you can start to compose things for particular brands in specific ways, or looking at the way that the lighting on the vehicles, both in the interior or even on the exterior of the cars, you're starting to see now on roads, there's cars where the turn signals are almost animated. And, Joey, you and I and anyone else listening to this is looking at a $80,000 car with animated turn signals and is thinking to themselves damn it, why couldn't have they just worked some easing into that? Just the tiniest bit of easing would have made it look so much more expensive. But instead, it's just this linear, But there's all of these different opportunities that are coming together that are all, they start in digital, but they inform this elaborate physical product in other ways. One of the projects that I can't unfortunately get into deep details, and I hope to be able to share some of this at some point in the near future. But we've been doing some amazing work with a robotics company and looking at the way that the digital experience ties into a product that has effectively no reference point for like, oh, we could just make it similar to the way the digital experience works on this other competing product or whatnot. It's this totally new white space where there's all of these fascinating new problems that need to be solved, that need to be figured out. And I love those sort of challenges because it's not just, oh, what's the aesthetic approach or what's the human factors approach, but we quickly get into these really deep conversations about like, well, what does this mean culturally? How do we make someone comfortable with this product that could be intimidating or maybe terrifying and whatnot, and finding the balance between all of those different attributes. So, and again, in that space, even, I find that motion design is a critical tool, not even for making or prototyping those experiences. It's a big part of what we do, but it's also a really critical tool for communicating to the stakeholders and the people that we're working with to guide them through this process and to communicate with them and just tell them like, you never, you guys are so focused on making this amazing product, but you also need to step back and think about like, well, what will someone feel like when they walk into a room and there's this product that's in the room with them that they might be afraid of, right? And how do we work through those sort of issues in a way that'll make the product itself effectively much smarter?
I mean, it almost sounds like a branding exercise, and how does the thing make you feel? And you're also making me think too, John, like, this term motion design that, I probably started using this term, I don't know, like 12, 13, 14 years ago. Before that, it was motion graphics. And motion design really, to me anyway, I started using it because it felt more legit. It's just like motion graphics, MoGraph, it just sounded kind of like, oh, it's kind of like a toy. Motion design felt like this discipline, but really it always felt a little weird because really mostly what I was doing was animating. What you're talking about really does feel like motion design. You're like, motion is now a tool that's being used on robots, on the robot butler, or like on an interface for a vehicle. SpaceX has motion designers like designing interfaces for their modules and stuff like that. So I'm curious, how do you see this sort of developing? I mean, like, are those types of clients, are they aware of what they need and the types of artists they need? And are they aware that there's people like you out there? Or is there still a few years ahead of us of we need to actually educate these clients that this is a thing they could be doing? Like, how savvy are these companies right now? Before you hear that answer, I want to make sure you know about our in-depth motion design curriculum at School of Motion. We don't just offer classes that you can take anytime. We also offer interactive, guided sessions that go deep into teaching you how to use design and animation software, but more importantly, the principles of good design, animation, illustration, 3D, and much more. You get to learn alongside other artists, and you even get feedback and support from your own personal teaching assistant, a professional motion designer who's part of the School of Motion community. Find out more on our site. The link is in the description.
So this is probably the single biggest challenge for our business, which is making sure that, it's a little bit easier to articulate if you have a client who is looking for a very specific set of deliverables or assets, or they say, oh, we need a team to make stylized 3D assets that will populate our experience or something like that. What we are doing is traditionally quite different than that. And even motion design for me isn't, it's not even useful in moving that conversation forward as a term, because our core focus is helping leaders who are trying to establish a vision for their products and where they are going to go, where they are going to end up. It is difficult, almost packaging that as a service. I would say, for us, one of the biggest challenges is that there's many of the clients that we are working with. I would say almost effectively all of the clients that we are working with did not hire an equivalent version of us last year. It was not something that they had been previously doing year after year or whatnot. And for us, it just comes down to finding the people that see the value in making sure that they are looking at how they can get ahead of where technology is going, understanding that they need a unique point of view that's not based on the existing paradigms and best practices that they've been using, and are comfortable enough in taking a little bit of a leap of faith with us. And, because of that, we pretty much require clients that are extraordinarily trusting, which you often only find at the very highest tiers, in C-suite and above, even in giant organizations, the people that are confident enough to sort of like make that leap or take that dive. And, for me, it's something that I feel a responsibility to continue to try and, evolve, what is even the branding of what we do. For the last year, we've continually adjusted the way we describe our service. At some points, describing it as a consultancy, which in many attributes I think is very accurate, because we provide a lot of guidance and insight, but we also feel gross being associated with some of the traditional consulting that's out there that is just a lot of like theoretical whiteboarding and, Xeroxing academic studies and handing them off as insight or as, quote unquote strategy. And we do believe that we, because we still love to make and build and create materials that exemplify any of this thought and process, we think it's important that is rolled into that process and that service, and that's happening not 6 months after we've defined personas and finished a lengthy discovery immersion sprint and whatnot, but it's almost right from the get-go. Just as soon as brainstorming is happening, there's also tangible, visible artifacts of that process. And there's designs that are being made, not to be pitched as, hey, should it go this way or that way, but just to say, like, we get so much more out of talking about these problems or challenges when we have something to look at and to circle around or to experience or to interact with or to hear or feel or whatnot as we're going through these very conceptual processes with our clients.
It really does sound like a consultancy in a way, because you're a problem solver. And I've said this a lot to, to various artists, that like in the end, if you're animating an explainer video for your client, what you're actually trying to do is solve a business problem that your client has with that video. You may not even be aware of that. When you move into the world that you're in right now, that's why they're hiring you. You're very aware of that. It's interesting. I actually just met a guy, and he has an online school, and he trains people to be what he calls chief AI officers. And his whole thing is basically consulting with companies large and small who have a business problem and think maybe AI could solve it because they keep hearing about AI, but they have no idea how. And he comes in and he knows all about LLMs and diffusion models and all the various technologies out there. And he can help them, kind of like you're doing on sort of the design and motion and interactivity side with AI. I'm curious, actually, maybe we should talk about AI. We haven't actually talked about it yet in this podcast, which is probably the first time in the last 10 podcasts that it's taken me this long to bring it up. Are you also like looking at AI? Is it also kind of part of the practice, like looking at how that as a tool can help sort of execute your client's vision and solve problems?
Yeah, I mean, effectively, I think right now every initiative that we're currently working on has some layer of AI woven into it, as a new problem to solve and to, figure out how we're getting ahead of this, really powerful new capability. I'd also note, I think anytime that AI comes up, especially in our space, right, around motion design, I think it triggers a tremendous amount of fear and anxiety, or at least it has the capacity to do so, right? And I don't think that fear or anxiety is unfounded. I don't like to take the approach of like, well, get on top of AI or get, left behind or whatnot. I have tremendous sympathy for the concerns and the things where people are maybe a little bit upset by what's happening in this space. At the same time, it's also very evident to me that AI is going to be a force multiplier across many industries, and certainly not just ours, but like, anyone that spends time sitting in front of a computer as a critical part of the work that they do. AI is going to disrupt and impact those spaces as well. I will note that in the space that I'm immediately in around product conceptualization and innovation, it's not a concern. It is not, nobody is, shaking in their boots that they're all going to be wiped out. In the worlds like, advertising and whatnot, I think I can appreciate that people can feel actively, entire corporations that are just looking at like, oh, cool, how do we extremely automate all of this? How do we do as much as possible with as few humans, with as few expensive, talented humans as we possibly can? And whatnot. But when it comes to the creation of experiences and products, I don't see any of that sort of hysteria at the moment. And I think we're gonna see the tools and the experiences evolve and change. And to me, they're nowhere near a point of like I see no AI tool that is like really ready for me to just have something that it generates that's like would be output to a client or even to a user of an experience or whatnot just yet. But I do find these tools and these platforms very helpful just in an internal process, whether that's, brainstorming or ideating and being able to use like GPT to look for blind spots in, a brainstorming session that's happening, or using, Mid-Journey to like sort of like pre-sketch ideas or concepts that help to, expose you to a vision that you might not have found if you weren't like working with 15 different concept artists simultaneously, as part of that process. I'm curious, Joey, how do you approach, and like from the School of Motion perspective, how do y'all approach the concept of AI?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting. I mean, I think there's very different viewpoints just internally, even at School of Motion. Personally, I'm very bullish on all of it, and I'll say the one thing that's helped me the most was really doing as much of a deep dive as I'm capable of doing into how these things actually work. Because the biggest critique I hear about them, it comes from artists who believe that this is somehow unethical because it's stealing other artists' artwork. And I'm very sympathetic to that idea. It really does appear that that's what it's doing. In truth, that's not what it's doing. I think the first time I realized, if you could look at the code that makes up Mid-Journey, none of the images that were used to train it are in that code anywhere. Those images are still separate from it. All it did was it learned how to make images like those by creating, a super elaborate set of rules that it can follow over and over again to create images. And to me, and I've had conversations about this on this podcast, to me, it's as if it's learning to be an artist the same way a human does by synthesizing and integrating. It's just way faster. and way better at replicating things. And sometimes that does lead to weird artifacts where the rules that it's created tell it, I should always have a little signature looking thing down here. And sometimes it looks a lot like a real signature, right? Yeah. But that real signature doesn't actually exist as an image somewhere inside of Midjourney. So personally, I'm just trying to be very pragmatic about it. Like I use it for, when we do like YouTube thumbnails and stuff, and we need an asset that doesn't exist or like all the stock photos are crap, we'll use it to make that. We're always modifying and designing around that stuff. And we're also, just to be honest, like still in a wait and see posture as far as like how much of that can we use without getting just demolished on social media too, right? Because we've seen that happen to a few brands already. So I'd say like what I predict is going to happen is that sooner or later, and I think it's probably going to be sooner than most artists are comfortable with, it's just going to be everywhere and it's socially acceptable and a lot of the backlash will quiet down. Because what are you going to do in the end? And the last thing I'll say, and I want to throw this back to you because I'd love to hear your perspective on this too. Like even something like Sora, and if people listening don't know what that is, that's OpenAI's text to video model, which felt like it came out of nowhere and just was light years past Runway ML and all these other text to video models. None of the other ones are even close to what Sora is capable of. And even looking at that, and I'm trying to imagine how I might use that in like client work, I would essentially, I think, be forced to use it the same way you'd use like stock footage or something like that. It's just because little tiny tweaks, if you work with clients, the level of control you need to give them exactly what they want. And Sora right now, apparently you'll prompt it and then you have to wait like an hour or more to get 30 seconds of video. And if it's not exactly what you want, you can't like tell it to change just that one thing. Have that human pause for a second and blink twice and then continue on, but everything else keep the same. That doesn't exist yet. And the level of control you'll eventually have, I assume, will still require artistry to wield, right? You'll just be able to get higher fidelity results quicker. So that's my take on it. I actually think it's going to create more work for editors and artists and motion designers. It is going to take away certain tasks that you used to be able to get paid for. I don't know how much rotoscoping work there is out there, right? Mm-hmm. I imagine eventually that will be almost entirely done by AI. No one seems to complain about that either, that you don't get a lot of backlash about RotoBrush. Yeah, I'm pretty bullish on it, to be honest. Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, and I think there's going to be some really interesting opportunities that branch out from it. I mean, one of the things that's already evident is that it's reminding anyone, no matter what level they are at in their own career, how to be a good director, right? Like you have to be able to communicate like a director and provide clear, precise articulation of your vision. And you need to have a vision that is worthwhile to input into these tools and into these things to get interesting results. I do think, and some of the things that I've been most interested in with the clients that we've been working with have been around this broad sort of concept of like, how do you train a hyper-specific AI for a particular task or for a particular brand or whatnot. And I think there's a world where at one point, there will be almost like think of doing a rebrand project and going through elaborate, dense brand guidelines and whatnot. And a big part of that will be creating a specific model for that brand, whether it's, generating specific materials or Sora-like video, but always doing it in that brand's aesthetic, which will introduce some new opportunities because it will become a little bit less about like, well, our brand has this color and this typeface, and it'll be more about like, our brand is everything looks like drone footage, or our brand is, has these other characteristics or intangible sort of aspects that you don't even necessarily articulate when you're seeing the final product, but you're feeling that come through. Speaking of feeling coming through, do you hear the insane sound coming
I was like,
from
is someone beating someone up? That's it's settling
one
down.
of the voices
I can hear
is
it.
getting quieter, and the other voice sounds like it got a little farther away.
Yeah.
It's an exciting episode of the
I know.
podcast.
Yeah. So you're making me think about. I've already sort of seen some of this, right? So like, there's apps out there, photo AI, right, where you can upload a bunch of images of yourself, and it trains on those, and then it can make as many images of you as it wants. You can try different clothing on, all this kind of stuff. And I think there has to be brands already using that sort of trick to say like, okay, well, this is, we hired these 10 models, maybe it's a clothing brand, and we just want to be able to use their likeness, like, to show off all these different things. And rather than have the expense of a full photo shoot every single time, now we do it once, we get all the, all the training material we need, and then we can modify it. And if that's not happening yet, it's only a matter of time. And, I guess like that's the kind of stuff where, okay, well, that means models are going to have probably less work. There's going to be new business models. Voiceover is something that I'm absolutely convinced is going to be totally disrupted. Because the quality of AI voiceovers has gotten absolutely like just mind blowing. There's actually AI music generation now that's not horrible. It's not great yet, but it's pretty good. It's better than you'd think. So I also wonder just about the business model of, performers, right? That to some extent can be replaced. I think we're a long way off from being able to replace Morgan Freeman or something like that, like an actual actor doing acting. But I think we're probably pretty close to where, your average mid-sized brand doesn't need to hire a human to do voiceover for everything. They can use a model and have it in 100 languages instantly all the way. So I'm curious, like, just on the business side, what you think about that.
Well, I think one of the key opportunities there, and there's going to be a bunch of stuff that will be just kind of at the like bottom tier of just like, yeah, give me an off-the-shelf model and we'll spit out infinite, banner ads or voiceovers or whatever. But I think there is going to continue to be a strong market, and was recently working with one of the major tech titans on an initiative that was all built around creating, basically training an AI model, but also looking at ways that model would be trained by specific artists and not through going on the internet and hitting save as on their images, but by contracting those artists to generate materials with the specific intent of it being training materials, so that once they had generated, a certain amount of, let's say, paintings or whatnot, we could train a model to paint in their style. And that was really important for this major brand who, for them, it was critical that in whatever they were creating, couldn't a year from now, all of a sudden the legal ambiguity is cleared up and they realize that this is like massively infringing on someone's rights by using a model that was just trained on ArtStation in its entirety or whatnot, right?
Right.
And I think there's going to continue to be, things that follow that sort of model. There's a recent episode of the 20,000 Hertz podcast, this amazing sound design podcast made by my buddy Dallas. And he dives into Hans Zimmer's process for making soundtracks for movies like Dune and whatnot. And now for every soundtrack that Hans Zimmer makes, rather than sitting down and just, cracking open the synthesizer and sort of prototyping the sounds, he finds some interesting exotic instruments, or in the case of Dune, it was voices. And he basically has this very complex recording session that goes on where they capture every possible note and intensity of that note that could be captured to then create a new synthesizer based on this new distinct thing. And for him, he's just like, this is the only way I can make fresh sounding new sounds. And like, we may even go back and re-record with this person, but I can also now make this completely distinct new thing using the keyboard, but because the keyboard was, built off of this particular singer's really exotic voice or something along those lines. And so I see a lot of interesting opportunities there for this sort of like artisanal model creation and calibration that will require a lot of, curation and guidance and direction to get those things dialed in, and will also help brands stay away from that lower tier. Like, I already am seeing Midjourney used in advertising, and like, you can spot, like, if you've been using Midjourney, you can spot just like there's something about like the sheen on the skin or the lighting fall off, and it's beautiful. It's gorgeous, but I see it and I know it's Midjourney, and that immediately cheapens the image to me. And worse is that I'm seeing those images used to advertise cheap or even shady products or experiences, right? Like, it's that sort of like bottom tier of like banner ads for, male enhancement or other like just weird things that used to have really, really crappy art or designs associated with it. And now it just has like nicer, more elegant content, but it just comes away feeling cheap and tacky. And there's going to be many brands will realize that they have no choice but to disassociate themselves from that.
Yeah. I mean, I have seen, there was right when the video models came out, there was this slew of, social media posts where people were cutting together little like fake trailers and things like that using these models. And almost all of them were bad. The imagery itself might have been super cool. There's like some really crazy sci-fi ones, and they take a Hans Zimmer track. But
everything's just slow motion. Someone's staring off into the middle distance, or fabric flowing in the breeze, or whatever. And you could see
it's just soulless
and feel those limitations. Yeah,
yeah. And then what that made me think was that you still have to have artistry, even when the hardest part used to be like taking a paintbrush and dipping it in paint and rendering what is in your mind. That's gotten so much easier. Photoshop made that easier, and all of the tools and plugins we use. AI just makes it that much easier to kind of get closer to the vision in your mind. You still have to have a good vision, and you still have to have good taste. And frankly, I think one of my predictions is that video editing, which is already a very valuable skill, especially in the age of YouTube, is going to become even more valuable in the age of these AI models, because if you're a good video editor and you know a little bit of After Effects, you can use these models and make amazing stuff. I have seen that too. But it requires almost probably the same amount of work as it would to do it traditionally. Maybe producing the assets takes a little less time. But I mean, the state of the art right now, you're still doing a ton of cleanup work and fixing things and removing the sixth finger and all that kind of stuff. I think, I don't know. I feel like the ability to say, I need an explainer video, here's my brand guidelines, and you walk away and 10 minutes later, there it is. If that's even possible, which I'm not convinced it is, I think we're at least a decade away from that. I'm curious that, we talked right before we were recording about optimism versus pessimism with all this stuff. And if you get on social media, there is a lot of pessimism about AI and sort of the effects of it. I am just an optimist basically for everything, and that includes AI. I'm actually pretty optimistic about it, but I'm curious, how do you feel about it? And maybe I'm gonna ask you this on two levels. On the one level, for the freelance motion designer that, does storyboards, animates in After Effects, gets hired at studios, does a day rate. Are you optimistic for them? And then there's the level you're at now, where you're helping companies realize what these tools can do for them. So maybe you could talk a little bit about like optimism and pessimism and sort of those two scenarios.
Sure. So I tend to default to optimism in general. And there's a core sort of principle around that BlackBox Infinite was founded on, and I'll kind of circle back to that. But I do think that the industry, like this industry is going to be disrupted, and many other industries will also be disrupted. And so when I think of like the artist at a studio getting a day rate, I'm optimistic for them. I'm pessimistic for anyone who's going into that space being like, cool, I've finally landed in the space where my plan is to set keyframes for $600 a day for the rest of my life, right? Like I have no optimism for that individual. I'm really optimistic for the people who I think are very common in our space, who are savvy and interested in new tools and new technologies and new opportunities, who are flexible and adaptable, like, which to me it's incredibly commonplace in this space. Like many motion designers on Monday are making typographic layouts and on Wednesday are making insane particle systems, right? I think this particular space lends itself to this kind of combination of like flexibility and ambition that I think will lend itself very well as things continue to be disrupted. And, you know, I'm obviously super bullish in the space that I'm in. We find a staggering number of clients and companies and gigantic brands who are all in this space themselves of like, we're excited about all these things that are happening. We ourselves are a little anxious or scared of all the different technologies that seem to be falling out of the sky left and right. But we're excited to take advantage of them. And we need people that can be sensitive to the pragmatic needs, but also have this incredibly imaginative approach to solve these problems in ways that they haven't been solved before. And so many of these things, there's just like infinite amounts of white space and new problems to solve there. So I'm obviously incredibly optimistic about where that space and where that sort of service goes. And I would certainly encourage others that are in this space to just take a step back from the discipline that they're working within and look at ways that you can just, you know, open up your field of view a little bit and just keep tabs on just that broader notion of the problem solving and being sensitive to the needs that are out there, and then figure out how that, you know, that magical capability that you've been fostering through your career can be channeled towards some of that. Just the last thing on this general topic of positivity, my partner and co-founder and I, we always find ourselves just coming back to this concept of what it takes to design a positive future. And when I was a little kid, there was a lot of things that were very inspiring to me about the future. And, you know, particularly a lot of that's just, of course, going to be like science fiction and things like that. And it was very excited by Star Wars, or even things like 2001: A Space Odyssey, that gave you this vision of, and there was like, you know, some evil robots in the mix and things like that, but you still saw these really aspirational visions of where the future was headed. When I was a little kid, Epcot Center opened up, and I just was like, oh, I gotta go there. That's the future. I have to visit that. That seems so amazing. Today, I didn't even go to Epcot Center when I was a kid. I never got there until I was like 25 or something. And at the point that I got to Epcot Center, like, nothing had changed since it was opened in, you know, 1985, except like the plastic had gotten a little more yellowed in the sun and whatnot. And, you know, today I look at the science fiction landscape, and the kids that are coming up seeing this stuff, they're being fed nothing but like crazy, oppressive Hunger Games and mega gritty Blade Runner vibes and all of these really, really dark futures. And so it's not that surprising to me that when we are headed into a huge technological shift, that people's immediate reactions feel very discomforted and very unsettled by this, because we're no longer used to seeing positive visions of the future. And it's definitely not like, it's not Hollywood's responsibility to pander to us by showing us that stuff. Like, entertainment is always going to be most entertaining when there's lots of conflict involved. And if that means and I love gritty cyberpunk aesthetic as much as any other, modern day creative does as well. But I do think that there's an opportunity, maybe even an obligation, that some of the big brands that are out there that are creating products and experiences that are going to shape the future, that they are really pursuing a positive vision of that future, and that they're sharing that with the world so that we can collectively have something that's a little more positive to be looking up to and be expecting from the future that we know is going to be very different from the way things are today. But we need more reasons to see how that's going to be better and not, like what we've seen at the multiplex.
I love that. Yeah, that hits in the right spot, dude. I really like that. I want to end on, trying to give our audience some advice here, because we're all sort of figuring this out in real time, this brave new world of AI, plus, even sort of on a lower level, you've got just software's changing so fast now. You've got Unreal Engine just launched this motion design tool. And so now they're kind of competing with VizRT and Chiron. And okay, that world's now, way more open. You've got Rive, which kind of dovetails very nicely into these interactive things. You've got new technology from Apple and makes AR way more palatable than it's ever been, right? And you said in the pre-interview, you actually said, there has been more money trading hands in digital product design than any other design discipline recently. And, you can see that like advertising dollars are shifting around. They're going to different places. They're going to social media where you don't want the really fancy 2D explainer video. You actually want Mark Zuckerberg holding a lapel mic in his kitchen, which I just saw. And so as a career, I think motion design, it's just evolving. It's evolving pretty quickly right now. And so most of the people listening to this probably aren't used to, synthesizing things and thinking as far into the future as you are and going out and selling that vision to clients. So do you have any advice for motion designers? Maybe they're a few years into their career, they've gotten good at the craft part, and now it feels like the ground is shifting. How do you sort of future-proof your career and make sure that, it's going to be okay, over the next 10 years?
I think everything you just mentioned is like mega relevant, particularly things like looking at just where are the trends going in terms of, is it better to have slick advertising or to have grassroots, social media sort of efforts and things like that. I think anybody in any of this space, whether it's motion design or fashion or anything else, you have an obligation to be attuned to just where tastes are going, where things are headed. There may be a scenario where, the sort of like motion design for a certain period of time used to just be like a required layer of slickness added on top of something, right? And maybe that won't be as necessary if people are just, cutting together the lapel mic videos or whatnot. But as a motion designer, you are still a latent, expert storyteller and communicator. And you can use, and I think, I get super inspired by the things that I see kids doing on social media, where it's not that they're creating something that has production value, but there's definitely very innovative ways of filming something, whether that's, there's a guy who just like sings into his phone while it's tied by a string to a ceiling fan. So the phone is like spinning around him while he's singing and whatnot. And I see that and I just think like, it's so brilliant. Like and it's so fun to watch and it's so interesting. And I think motion designers have that sort of like combination of like curiosity and excitability just built within us, and to just always be looking for new ways that you can apply that to whatever it is that you're working on, and not obsess as much over like, I'm going to exclusively make particle simulations for 4K renders to be used in commercials or whatnot, but just look at like, how can any of this stuff apply to any other attribute of your life? You know, once every 60 days or so, when it's a rainy day and my kids are bored to death, we'll just pull out iPhones and we'll record something, and then we'll try to do something fun with it in After Effects or play with the sound in GarageBand or whatnot. And it just, that experience reminds me like, yeah, there's so much fun that you can have outside of these traditional ways of presenting value to the masters that we are working for. And my hope is that as you continue to do that, you're finding these new ways, you're also pushing yourself to get out of the space of, I must, provide value to these masters, and instead start getting yourself into that position of saying, I'm going to be the welcoming hand that is outstretched to the client to say, come with me. I will show you how we can create value for your audience or your product or your brand or whatever it may be. Because it's still just, one of my biggest frustrations with motion design being this almost like bastard byproduct of the advertising industry is that was, there's a lot of weird emotional stuff that's embedded in this industry that's just about like, how do we make the client happy, that sometimes actually gets in the way of taking a little more control of that relationship with your client and guiding them towards the answer or adjusting or rewriting their brief in a way that will be more valuable to them. And I find is if you can make that step and that leap from the sort of, vendor or service provider to trusted expert, trusted guide, to someone who's telling, you get on the call with the client and it's not, tell me exactly what you need me to make for you. And instead it's like, relax, take a deep breath. We're going to tell you where this should all go. If you can make that leap, I find the clients appreciate that significantly more, and it fosters much stronger bonds and relationships and leads to much more fulfilling creative exercises in these spaces that we work in.
Thanks so much to John for coming on. Head to blackboxinfinite.com to stay up to date on what he and his partner Jared are up to, and make sure, please, that you are subscribed to our YouTube channel so you don't miss any of the incredible guests we have coming up on the pod. You can also listen to this podcast on all streaming platforms, and we love feedback. So leave a comment or hit us up on social @School of Motion and let us know what you thought of this episode. That's it for now. I'll see you next time.